cosas. No sé por qué, pero o sea, mis nietos han pasado cosas muy feas y yo también.
Son kwamba la karanda. Abunda karanda dua ndo ya karanga kai.
Welcome to the people in the room and to the people who have joined us online. The reason we're here today are some of the people that you saw in the video just now in neglected crises around the world. And the fact that there are so many people in the room and online gives us hope that we can address the chronic neglect. This is the 7th year that we present this report. But this year there is something particular about this list. And it's that in addition to the chronic neglect that we see in the top 10 countries this year, we've also started to see evidence of how the redirection of aid and attention towards Ukraine is exacerbating already dire situations in these countries. And that's part of what we'll be discussing today. As many of you know, the neglected crisis list is based on 3 criteria. It's political neglect or lack of political attention. It's neglect by the media, lack of media attention, and of course it's also a lack of humanitarian funding or underfunding of these crises, and we'll discuss that further with our panelists today. So first let me just introduce our panelists. My name is Leila Matar, I'm the Director for Advocacy and Media here at the Norwegian Refugee Council. To my right, I have Gunn Jorid Roseth, Deputy Director General at the Department for Multilateral Affairs at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. To her right, we have Will Worley, climate correspondent for DevEx. He's also a former UK correspondent who has written extensively on UK aid cuts and also covered funding trends, including here in Norway. Then we have Siri Aas Rustad, which is the research director at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. And finally, Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we kick off, if you already want to take action starting today to address neglected crises and you're watching online, you will see a QR code in the screen as well as a link in the Facebook chat where you can already contribute to addressing neglected crises. And I'm sure our panelists today will inspire you. Before we go to our panel debate, I'm really pleased that we have with us on the screen our country director at the Norwegian Refugee Council for the world's most neglected country this year, Burkina Faso. Joining us live from Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Thanks for coming. Hassane, can you hear us? To be expected from the world's most neglected country. The internet will not always work perfectly.
No, go again.
Hassane, can you hear us? Excellent.
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you. Hassane, thank you for joining us and the many that are watching in live and in the room. We've just watched the video presenting the world's most neglected crises with Burkina Faso on top this year. And it's the first time that Burkina Faso has made it to the top of this grim ranking. Could you please tell us, Hassane, what does the situation look like on the ground, and what does this neglect mean for people in Burkina Faso?
Thank you so much. The situation in Burkina Faso has rapidly deteriorated over the last years. We have a deep displacement crisis that has forced more than 2 million people to displace within the country. By the end of last year, we have more than 6,000 schools that were forced to close, preventing 1 million of children from enjoying their right to education. But all this is the consequence of an increasing level of violence that are affecting people in the villages, and the situation is becoming more and more worrying. Just to give you an example of the deterioration of that trend is that in March 2022, we have only 5 localities that are blockaded. By the end of the year 2022, this number has grown to 23. This means that 23 villages, 23, some of our big cities, are completely isolated from the rest of the country. They cannot even go outside their city. They are completely dependent on the humanitarian assistance.
Thank you, Hassane, for painting a picture for us here in the room. What do you think can be done to address this situation?
We are in a context of a country which is among the poorest in the world. So even before the crisis, we have a number of people who are living under poverty. Now with the crisis, these people have no access to any kind of livelihood, and they are also under pressure from the violence. So this means that the humanitarian needs are growing year after year. So what is urgently needed is to ensure that the humanitarian needs are covered, so that humanitarian assistance will have the capacity to reach people who are in need. The second thing is that the access has been a challenge in this country because of the violence, because of the use of IEDs on roads. Many localities can only be reached through air bridge. So we need to ensure that there is a level of access that will not rely on air bridge. We need also to make sure that humanitarian actors are not targeted so that they can work and take assistance to people who are in need without any kind of pressure, without any kind of fear. People should not be targeted because they are providing assistance to people who are in need. And of course, we also need to make sure that the international community draw more attention to crises like what we are observing in Burkina Faso, deteriorating year after year without any visibility on what are the solution for the coming month and year. So this country needs support from its partners.
Thank you, Hassane. And on that international support, we have politicians listening in, we have donors listening in the room with us today, we have media, and also the general public. Do you have any messages for them about the kind of support that we need for Burkina Faso?
Yes, the message I have to them is that the crisis in Sahel has now been going over and over. And because of the lack of attention, because of the lack of enough funding, we have observed that needs are increasing and many people are not getting access to assistance. So it is really important to ensure that this country is supported so that people who are in need will get more assistance. This is a minimum of solidarity that these people deserve. And I hope that this report will draw more attention to Burkina Faso so that we will have more capacity to serve these people who are in their situation.
And then just to put you on the spot with one last question, zooming out from Burkina Faso a little bit, you're currently our country director there, but soon you will be our regional director for NRC for the whole of Central and West Africa region. So looking in, and of course that region is always on the list and heavily represented. So what do you think will be your main challenge in your new job to ensure that rights are respected and people are protected across this neglected region?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think one of the challenge is to ensure that we draw enough attention on all these neglected crises with millions of people who are left without assistance, who cannot enjoy their right. We need to make sure that these crises in the Sahel and in other parts of Africa receive the required level of attention, so that we will prevent the situation where millions of people are left without assistance. I think this is one of the challenge that we need to address together.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us, Hassane. All right. Thank you. Now that we've set the stage with Hassane's introduction, I want to turn to the panel with us today. And let's start by hearing a little bit more about the current situation for people in displacement crises. And I'll start with you, Jan. We've been producing this report for 7 years now. Why do we do this?
Well, we are in NRC, like any other humanitarian group, as any humanitarian donor, governed by some fundamental humanitarian principles. Humanity, we help people in their hour of greatest need, wherever they are. Neutrality, we don't take side in political conflicts. We're not for this or that party to the conflict. We're neutral to that. We're in favor of the victims of conflict. We don't take side in the conflict. Thirdly, independence. We're not part of any governance, government or anything. We're funded by the Norwegian government. We're independent of them. We're independent of NATO. We're independent of everybody. We're there for the people in need. And then fourthly, and most importantly in this context, it's impartiality. What does that mean? That people should get aid according to their needs, not according to their skin color or whether they're in favor of the West or against the West or they are of this or that religion. So it's a violation of the fundamental principle of impartiality when there are tens of millions of people who are not getting any aid because we have no resources for them. There is no attention for their suffering. They suffer alone. So tens of millions of people suffer alone is something that keeps us up at night. And in NRC, we tried to do our best. Whatever we have of free money, we give to the neglected crisis. We try to send people there. We try to have our emergency teams go there, etc. We have more people in the Democratic Republic of Congo than we have in Ukraine. But we have 10 times more funding, nearly, for Ukraine than we have for the Democratic Republic of Congo. Is there too much to Ukraine? No, there's not too much to Ukraine. Ukraine should be the standard, really. It's the one operation on earth where we're fully funded, where we have full attention of media, and full attention of decision makers. But from Burkina Faso to the Congo to the Latin American countries, we say we have too little of everything.
You've spoken to the disparity that we're seeing now between the correct level of attention and aid to Ukraine and what we're seeing in neglected crises. Are there other trends or particular developments in this year's report?
Well, I think there are two trends this year compared to the other years. Number one is that we have more than in any time in my 40 years as a humanitarian worker, one totally absorbing conflict for us in the West, and that's Ukraine. It's war in our own continent, so of course it would affect us, and it's a horrific war. 14 million people displaced. But it didn't get better in Burkina Faso because it got worse in Ukraine. It got worse in Burkina Faso and all of these other places because food became more expensive, fuel became more expensive, everything is more difficult. So Ukraine is unfortunately overshadowing these other places. And then one other trend I would say is that Africa has been on the list all the time. We are institutionally discriminating against conflicts, needs in Africa compared to other places. But Latin America also have increasing humanitarian crisis, and they're getting too little attention. So 3 of these 10 places are in Latin America.
Yeah. And you talked about how things are getting worse, Jan, and certainly for those of us who work with this report year after year, it does feel indeed like it is getting worse. But Sidi, you work with data and trends in conflict areas around the world. Is it getting worse?
So looking at the conflict trends for the past decade, we actually see that less people are killed in conflict than previously, which is a good sign, I guess. We see the spikes that are single conflicts like Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. The data for 2022 is not out yet, but we know it's going to be high. However, measuring people being killed in conflict is just a measure of how intense a conflict is. So what we have done is that we look at people living in conflict, and we have developed a methodology for that, and looking at how many people actually live within 50 kilometers of a conflict event. And that number has increased over the years. So from 1990, where we have started measuring this, until 2021, where we have the data now, we see a doubling from about 500 million to 1 billion. So that number is increasing. And that is what this is about, right? I mean, the intensity that is severe, but that is what we see in Ukraine. But it is this, in neglected countries, we see the people being harmed. And even if it's a low intensity conflict and only a few people killed, living in conflict is so much worse than living in peace, even if it's low intensity. So yes, it is getting worse.
Yeah. And in what way is it getting worse when we look at the 10 countries on this list? So 7 in Africa, 3 in Latin America that have made it into the list this year. What do you think, based on your research, characterizes these conflicts?
So on the list, the 10 countries, they're obviously different, but some similarities are a lot of these countries are long-standing conflicts. Not high intensity, not Ukraine or Syria, but low intensity, but still in conflict. That means that a lot of people are living endemically in conflict. They experience conflict over and over and over again every year, which means that there is more people displaced, but they're also harmed in different ways: infrastructure, health, education. So that is one similarity. And as Jan mentioned, we see an increase in conflicts, and not necessarily civil wars, which is what we mostly think about when we talk about conflict. But in Latin America, we see a lot of gang conflicts and what we call non-state conflicts, so conflicts between not state actors. So in Mexico, for example, there's a lot of drug cartels, but it acts like conflicts. Like for people living close to that, it feels the same. And we see the same now in El Salvador and Venezuela, which is, a lot of contagious from the conflict in Colombia. But yeah, these long-standing conflicts that drags people down over time. I think is the most characteristics.
Thank you for that. So that takes us to, what do we do about this? Obviously, as humanitarian actors, NRC and our partners do what we can to address the humanitarian crises, but ultimately that's a band-aid. It's a critical band-aid, but it is a band-aid. And so in looking at how to remove the causes of conflict and addressing the conflicts themselves, I'd like to turn to you, Gunn. Norway is obviously one of the countries most actively involved globally in peace negotiations and peace mediation. Why is there so little peace diplomacy for some of these most neglected countries?
Oh, big question. No, I think thank you, and also to my fellow panelists, and of course for the Refugee Council to put this, letting these voices be heard. I wanted to say that to start with. As for the peace diplomacy, I think if you look at the Norwegian experience, I can only speak on behalf of the Norwegian government. I think, of course, in Norway we have a tradition of a risk willingness in the government. I think a close dialogue between any sitting government and the parliament, so that there's sort of a political room to maneuver in this regard. I don't know, in other countries maybe that's not part of the same political culture that enables governments to sort of work in the long-term perspective because of peace negotiations, peace incentives. It requires a lot of patience, a lot of, it's a waiting game. So this goes beyond any parliamentarian period. So I think that could be part of the explanation. I don't want to sort of put my finger at any other countries. I just sort of, based on the experience that we see here and how we work on the long-term perspective, because you have to sort of get to know the parties, you have to engage with the parties that are willing to seek solutions, and you have to wait for that moment to occur, because this initiative cannot come from us in a way. It has to come from the parties in the conflict. So that could sort of be one part of the explanation. I think for us, of course, we have a long-standing commitment to peace and negotiations. We have a peace and reconciliation sections. We have at any given point 15 to 20 people working in the ministry every day, not only on the sort of visible projects, but also on more hidden conflicts, and also to map this. So that could be, so that's the political commitment from our side is certainly there.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. And are there particular examples you would highlight in terms of Norway's peace involvement to address crises, especially neglected ones?
I think when it comes to the report we've seen today, I think Colombia, Venezuela, of course, comes to mind. The Middle East, it's been sort of a decade or a generation of diplomats working in this field, as Jan, of course, knows, but it's something that we will continue to do. But if you bring it back maybe a little bit to the humanitarian context, because one thing is the peace and reconciliation work as such, but how do we work also as a humanitarian actor in these crises? I think since that's sort of the department I'm representing today also. And I think, of course, Norway as a large provider of funds, and we can talk more about that. We've actually increased the humanitarian budget this year, partly due to the crisis in Ukraine, but also adding additional funds to people affected other places in the world. But when I speak to Jan or his colleagues from other humanitarian organizations, our discussions is not that often about the funding, but about the principles and sort of providing that space also in conflicts for humanitarian partners. And as Jan said, of course, this importance of neutrality and on the principled approach, we always respect that. We know the humanitarian partners work, but we as governments have to work to provide that space, always engaging in the Security Council, with the sort of countries or with non-state actors, that the humanitarian principles are there, access should be provided, protections of civilians is at the key. So that's something that the government will also continue to do. And I think of course, I think there's a lot of media attention now about the big important meeting going on currently in Oslo, but on Monday our foreign minister and the Minister of Development will welcome a lot of humanitarian partners and countries to Norway on a conflict about children in armed conflict. So I think what we can do is provide flexible fundings, principled approach, and also then to be one of the countries that also give voice to the civilians, to the children, to women, to the vulnerable in these conflicts. And then in addition, and then of course also then addressing this to some not sort of recognized actors, because that's part of the political sort of responsibility we as a government have. Yeah.
What do you think about that, Jan? I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think about Norway's role, both as Gunjorud was saying, as a humanitarian actor, but also as a peace actor. And what more would you like to see from the NRF?
Well, I think Norway has actually been among the better in systematically trying to foster diplomacy around a number of neglected crises. We also have this center called NOREF, which is funded by the ministry, which is doing a lot of humanitarian diplomacy. There is this Oslo forum for mediators coming and from very many places. What I would like to see perhaps even more of is a fostering of work in place. So too often, I mean, I'm glad. Well, Afghanistan is not the list. I was just in Afghanistan. You know, that envoys meet in Doha is good. More should be in Kandahar and in Kabul. That there are conferences in Paris on the Sahel, fine. But it should be ideally in Burkina Faso, speaking to the military. There should have been more work. Sudan is on the list. There were many warning signals that there was a building military conflict. Why wasn't there more work there in Sudan between the two generals that was in a way building a conflict? Now it's good that things are happening in Riyadh. I think it's a vicious circle also. I mean, the Norwegian media are interested in a hangar ship where every marine going in or out and to a bar is covered real time. There is nothing on Burkina Faso. So then a journalist says, "Oh, it's not so well. It's too far away, really." Well, what about the story? 23 cities are blockaded. There are 800,000 people there. They are being starved. These are families. It's a drama beyond belief. And covering Bakhmut street by street, basement by basement, is that more interesting than covering 23 cities blockaded, and they may starve to death? I mean, if nothing happens. So, more media would lead to more action, more parliamentarians, in addition to Mr. Ulstein, who is here thankfully present, being interested in this, and then we have really more action in Burkina Faso as well.
Do you agree, Gunjorud? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree. And I think we can do more. I think we're proud that we also managed to host the Lake Chad conference in Niger together with Germany and the UN, and we were there. And I think we keep to be reminding. You have to keep reminding us and sort of being that watchdog to sort of keep us on our toes in that regard. But I think we cannot, as a government, be everywhere, and we cannot have an embassy in all countries or involved in all the process. But we try, at least with the toolbox that we have. And speaking again of the humanitarian, how we have set up our policy and system to provide the flexibility to our partners, so that you can also, without us dictating with sort of commas and where you are to be involved, and you have that possibility to the funding also then to be active in these conflicts, but then also through that raise our awareness about the situation and the principle and sort of political things that needs to be raised. So, thank you.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Siri, if the mic. We've heard a little bit here about political solutions and sharing responsibility for those as well. From your research in PRIO, what do you think in terms of political solutions and beyond? What can be done to address these conflicts and these neglected crises?
So I think We've done some research on more local effects of, for example, aid, and I think this also speaks to Jan says about we cannot deal with this far away. We need to do it locally. And what our research actually finds is that aid works, which is great. I mean, we looked at child health, school, and we look at how it actually affects really closely to where the aid is located. But what we also see is that aid is not equally distributed, and it's the worst places that do not get aid. So it works where it is, and there could be many reasons for that. I mean, aid is great, it helps people, but it's also because these are places where you have the infrastructure. You're piggybacking on other aid projects, so you get a cluster of aid. Well, there are other areas that do not get aid, and we don't see the same development. So one thing is to be more aware of where we actually contribute, and also this comes back to inequality. So there are certain areas that do get less because maybe they are not the same ethnicity as the government, or there are things like that. So there are this type of inequality of where aid is distributed also creates more inequality, which also creates more conflict. So I think that is sort of the message we want to send when it comes to aid efficiency, is that it works, but it needs to go to everyone, especially those most in need.
Yeah, and if it works, we have an extra responsibility to make sure it's equally distributed, don't we? So I think we've talked a lot about political solutions, and as you said, it's all interlinked, so we've also touched on funding. But I want to zoom in on both funding and media attention a little bit further. Those are the two other aspects that the report looks at. And I think it was mentioned, more than 5 times more articles were written about the Ukrainian displacement crisis last year than about all the world's 10 most neglected crises. That's a pretty staggering number. So I wanted to ask you, Will, as a journalist, Davex is of course among the media outlets that does cover, to a greater extent, some of these neglected crises. But can you tell us your thoughts about why there is such little media attention and coverage of the crises on the list this year?
Sure, thank you, and thank you very much for having me. And this has always been a sort of an interesting dichotomy. In my mind, I very much agree with what you've been saying, but I also feel that I should be sort of standing up for journalism a little bit, as much as some of its habits frustrate me. I think probably one of the first things to say is resources, just like political attention and capital. Journalism is under huge strain. There are the business model is pretty broken. It's a very unstable kind of environment, and international news and going to these crises is not cheap at all. So that's probably the first thing, and that affects how editors choose stories. I think a colleague of this pointed this out to me as well, is that there are digital tools now where you can see what stories are being clicked on in real time, and if a story about Burkina Faso or Sudan or Mali is not being clicked on, you can see it right up there on the screen in the newsroom in front of everybody, and your name is next to that. And if it doesn't do well, other things are going to do well, then the incentives of the newsroom are to keep doing the stories that are doing well, rather than the ones that are not getting eyeballs. And sadly, a lot of the stories about countries on this list are not ones that tend to do well, especially in a very digital kind of first environment. Now, that's not inevitable, there are ways to change that. And I think a lot more kind of creativity is sort of needed. But this also relates, I think, to institutional habits and norms around these sorts of crises. Editors, especially in a country like the UK, where the news media is a fairly conservative culture, they have a very rigid idea of what they think their readers want. That also plays into it as well. And there is something called compassion fatigue, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. That also influences editorial decisions. So it's not easy, but I've been very frustrated with this myself over my career as a freelancer, trying to pitch stories about aid or development or humanitarian issues, which I thought, like Jan did, were fascinating. The editors didn't seem to think so. I can't place them, what can I do?
Yeah. Really interesting what you say about incentive structures, which can be notoriously difficult to change. I'm wondering also, a lot of the countries on this list are actually really hard to reach. You can't just jump on a flight and go there in many circumstances. So I'm curious, Will, to what extent do these access challenges pose an issue for coverage, and what's it like for journalists like you to actually be there and work on these crises?
I should know, thanks to COVID and covering Whitehall policy, I haven't been out in the field for quite some time, and I guess I've always been a freelancer. I've always had to get myself to these stories, often like under my own bug. So that obviously has its own limitations, and where journalism doesn't pay very much for these stories, that you can't do that forever. Even for a big news organisation, they're going to be thinking about cost, they're going to be thinking about risk. And so if there is a high risk of sending a journalist to places like, no one wants to see their people killed, and people, it's if the money thing is a constant issue. When there is a major war going on in Europe, which they know there is massive interest in, then as we've seen, that's been prioritised.
Thanks for that. And you were talking about the link between what people care about and the incentive structures around what media reports, and then of course there's a strong correlation, as you were saying, Jan, between media coverage and funding. And I think you quoted that for every dollar raised per person in need in Ukraine last year, just 25 cents were raised per person in need across the world's 10 most neglected crises. Another staggering fact that's very similar to the one I cited earlier about media coverage. And so going back a little bit to Norway's role, and you touched on this, Norway is amongst the most principled donors, and you spoke about how principles are an important part of the discussions that you have. But of course the aid budget has increased substantially, and yet there are trade-offs. Tough decisions have to be made. Could you say a little bit about how you consider principles and how you have those debates internally to make decisions?
Yes, thank you. No, I think and this is also maybe easy to find if you read our humanitarian strategy, focusing on the humanitarian assistance now, and which has been revised at the moment. But no, I think point one, of course, it helps to have a large budget. Then it's easier to be principled, and your voice is heard, and the government is willing to use it. And for our Security Council tenure, protection of civilians was one of the prioritized sort of policy areas that should be sort of recognized in any statement, any resolution. So that is the one thing that we can do as a large donor, also to use that sort of size to put the principled approach forward. And I think then, of course, even though we could have probably tripled the budget or quadrupled it, then the needs would still be, unfortunately, as we also read today, larger than what we could provide. So I think we have to try to be as smart as possible about the funding. And then it's sort of to work harder to increase our unearmarked funding to the UN system, to have the flexible partnerships with our humanitarian partners, so that the ones who are able to sort of then channel their resources and be operational quick to sort of then meet the needs. Then we also worked on a sort of criteria basis to make sure that the sexual and gender-based violence is addressed with our partners, children in armed conflict, as I said, the IDPs, to have some themes that for us as sort of who wants to be seen as a champion for protection of civilians, that we also have this asked to our partners, so that we at least try to reach the most neglected countries, the most severely hit countries, but also the persons who are most vulnerable in those countries. So yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and of course the aid budget has increased. As you said, it can't increase as to meet the needs necessarily, but it has increased, and yet a lot is also still going to dealing with the refugee situation at home in Norway, as it is in many other European countries as well. How do you grapple with that dilemma and that tension?
No, I think it's a sort of a well-established tradition. It's been there for many years. This is something that the government. This is sort of also within what is sort of formally approved to do, and I think it's also discussions that is sort of coming in the very transparent and discussions with the parliament every year when the budgets are presented. So I think that, that's one thing that's important. That's the transparency. That this is something that we do openly. But I think yeah, it's no secret that this is something that all governments will try to find, of course, the right way to make sure that, of course, the majority of development assistance budget will be actually used in the field, but we are also responsible as a large donor, as party to the refugee conventions, to convention, to also make sure that we are able to receive and fulfill our obligations when it comes to receiving refugees in Norway.
Would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, if I may. No, I also think we can be better in all of this. I mean, there are two problems with the humanitarian workers. We're repeating the same story again and again. It's really bad here. Send more money. And very often, I don't know how many times I've edited out. The world has to wake up. Send more money. We need. I mean, again, I'm back to Burkina Faso is a tremendously dramatic story. I mean, in 5-6 years, it's gone from the Switzerland of Africa to being one of the exploding crises on the planet. 23 cities blockaded. It's a drama beyond belief. It's ticking towards catastrophe, etc., etc. Of course, we also need to be better in saying it should. I mean, they pick up the phone every single day to interview Norwegian military from NATO Norway to be objective observers on the conflict in Russia, where Norway is a party. I mean, it's not like all of the journalists are going to Ukraine. Basically, it's done from here with people from here. So why not interview Hassane? We can also serve better the stories, the drama there, and finally, it's not hopeless. We're making progress. I mean, DRC, Burkina Faso, Colombia, Venezuela, etc. We're reaching millions there. It's the best investment for taxpayer money, and we need to get the success stories out.
You've been watching this closely, Will. What do you think?
Yeah, I think on the dramatic point about Burkina Faso being dramatic crisis, I want to kind of link that back to the crippling damages that journalism has seen over the past decade or so. Like across the board, foreign bureaus have been cut. Like the editorial understanding of what's going on, just beyond the horizon is very, very poor. And it used to be the case that you would have very specialist editors, journalists who've been working these patches for decades. That's very, very rare now. And the most experienced ones, we're off to Ukraine. So I think that's partly why there is that lack of understanding from a news perspective. That's not it.
No, I just wanted to comment quickly on this point because I think it's important also to acknowledge, the dangers that humanitarian workers are in, that journalists are in these conflicts, and sadly, I guess as employers, or you have to also sometimes think about the safety of your own personnel, and I think that sort of adds on to the storm in a way that some of these neglected crises are so dangerous to operate in, even for humanitarian workers, which is something that we as a government, of course, also will keep on reminding all countries or armed groups that if you seize control of an area, regardless if we recognize them as an sort of legal entity to govern a country or an area, but if you seize that control, you have a responsibility to protect people, to provide access for humanitarian workers without them being in harm. But I think with the point you said, it's the finances, but it's also very dangerous to operate in some of these areas, and some of the things that maybe used to be respected, we see also that the lines are getting a bit more blurry, unfortunately.
Right, we're kind of getting into the bigger picture now, which is behind these neglected crises and the state of the world more generally. The fact that journalists and humanitarian workers are now seen as legitimate targets it points to the really dangerous direction the world is heading. And a lot of these problems, obviously aid is key, but the politics is probably even more key, especially in the middle income countries that are on this list. So we're basically seeing these crises are a victim of the broader politics, which is soaking up the bandwidth of the traditional donors that would have formerly been most interested in solving these problems.
Jan, I'd love your reaction to this.
I mean, I agree, but the reality is a little bit like Priyo reminding us. One of the big progress is that many fewer people die in these conflicts than before. I mean, we haven't seen a big genocide in a long time, really. In the 1990s, many more people died than now, but many more people are affected. There are slightly more casualties among humanitarian workers, but that's also why we are 5 times more people out there. We actually have much better risk management, and the duty of care for staff is very high. So actually, there is no excuse for not being much more present in the Congo, in Burkina Faso, in all of these places, with many more people. We did not evacuate from Sudan. I think it was a mistake that so many organizations took out all of their international staff. It was a mistake that so many took out their international staff when COVID raged and so on. We need to take, we can do risk management actually. We need to be there when people need us in these places. We're committed to scale up in all of these. But we then need more attention, more resources, and more help from diplomats and politicians.
I think it's good to wrap up this conversation on that point, because the report, as you will see, it has recommendations to international donors, to the media, but also to humanitarians, because we have to look at ourselves as well and what we can do better. I'd like to then open up for questions from the people in the room as well as online. If you're online, you can put questions in the Facebook chat. And my colleague here will come to you. So we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then we will hear from our panelists. Please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Alice Ovilla and I work at the Embassy of Sweden. And I had a question for Gunjorid. So more specifically, this report, how do you see it influencing Norwegian foreign aid policy? Or are you already convinced that what you're doing is efficient, or will it have an effect?
A few other questions? Back.
Thank you. Hi, it's Craig from the Norwegian Refugee Council, the Global Youth Specialist, and a lot of these conflicts have massive youth populations who are affected by the conflicts. But in those countries there's also huge youth activists, as peace builders, as humanitarian workers, and often they have the digital skills to tell their own stories, but without an intermediary like NRC to get to the media. So I guess what's the barriers from the media side and even the humanitarian organisation side on linking up youth activists and youth displaced to tell their own stories and to have that impact? And I guess on the political level, what's the barriers within Norwegian Parliament to actually open up space for youth from all 10 countries to come and speak directly to members of Parliament there?
Thanks. Any last question before we turn to the panel? No?
Do we have anything online?
Yes.
Oh, yep.
Thank you. My name is Michael from the Embassy of South Sudan. My question is just a simple question. As you are dealing with the refugees, in those various countries in Africa, there is an issue of the issue of people asking for resettlement. So, what other program do you have, in the state of resettlement? Because the resettlement issue is becoming a old issue. The locals are coming up and saying, okay, people are coming, a lot of people are coming to our country, and the issue of land and all that. So the question is, what other programs do you have to release the Sahel? Thank you.
Let's do a round starting from you.
Thank you. Now to the question from our Swedish colleague. No, I think we should never be convinced because we have to keep evolving the policy, and I think, but it's also important to sort of course, always be reminded of the different roles that we have. So the NRC has presented a report. This is their sort of cry to us to sort of keep to get our attention to this crisis, which of course that's already a success. I'm here, and we will read it carefully. So no, I think it's an ever-evolving process, and I think in all of the different policy areas I've been working on through my career in the ministry, also a bit in and out of this humanitarian sphere, I think this is one of the policy areas also where we have a very open dialogue with our partners, and as I said, I have to always repeat, we have different roles. They are independent, but we listen very carefully to the input that we get from our UN partners, from our Norwegian partners, because I think we need to make sure that what we do as donors at least provides them with the tools and the flexibility that they need. So no, we will study this report very carefully and have a good discussion with the NRC, with other partners, and then always keep adapting and adjusting and improving, hopefully. Thank you.
So on the point about media access, media interest in kind of youth activists, I mean, it entirely depends on what they have to say, and it has to hook into what's considered a story by editors. Some people might approach this sort of thing a bit warily as well, because I've done this sort of thing before, and it's a youth activist in a global south country, but clearly what they're telling me are lines that have been drafted up in the building just like this one. I'm not interested in pretending it's like speaking to a press officer. And so that's why journalists are a bit wary of kind of going through press offices in that way. I think more broadly there is a kind of, especially in kind of the mass media, there's a sort of the same editorial interest of ideas about perceived reader interest. But I guess there's ways around that with these new forms of media that are around as well, TikTok being a big example. So there's probably room to get creative.
Just picking up on that, I think one of the problems with youth, or not youth activists, not them, but accessing them, is the internet access. So, for example, as I said, the data for conflicts in 2022 has not been published yet, so I can't say the numbers, because then Uppsala will not be happy with me. But what we know is that the conflict in Ethiopia is probably just as bad as the one in Ukraine, if not worse. And this is all in the Tigray region, and they have no internet. It's been, due to the conflict, it's been blocked out. So you don't get that access, and you don't get people TikToking because they don't have access to internet. So I think conflicts also limits, in neglected area, it limits people's ability to reach out as well.
And so just to piggyback on that, you mentioned earlier that deaths in conflict is sort of an indicator of the intensity of conflict, and you compared Ethiopia and Ukraine there. How is it in terms of people killed? Is it Ukraine like most people would think?
Okay, Ukraine is probably as people think. Ethiopia is going to shock people. It's probably going to be about the same as Ukraine. So, and then you can come to our seminar in 2 weeks.
Good, we will.
Yeah, and again, we save lives more effectively and efficiently, and protect lives more effectively and efficiently than ever before. Our problem is we're not saving livelihoods, we're not giving hope, including to the youth. So tens of millions or more are in dependency, they are displaced, they have no future, but we're keeping them alive. I mean, because they get emergency relief, and we are the world is sort of avoiding some of these horrific genocides that took place in Rwanda and elsewhere without really witnesses. On relocation, relocation is one of the three solutions to a refugee crisis. It's either integration, return, or relocation to another safe place. Could be Norway or America or the Gulf countries. And we're getting less and less of all three things, basically, or rather, there are more people fleeing and staying in a place elsewhere, and they're not being integrated, not having a safe return, nor relocation to a third place. So that's one of our biggest challenges, is to get solutions to all of these neglected crises, and of course relocation in places like Norway need to be increased. We're having very small refugee quotas. US is way down also on that, etc. But listen, there are 100 growing economies in the world. Where are they as donors and relocation places, etc.? Where's the Asian countries that are really donors and relocation places, etc.? And they have money to put satellites up in outer space and have Olympics and world championships and so on, but they can't afford neither relocation nor really aid. So of course we also need to be better in advocating something there. I'd like actually to commend Norway for the extra funding. But a final word also on that. I mean, the so-called Nansen package was, of course, unique in the sense that it also had a South package. 5 billion, wasn't it? Divided in two, and it's helping us in a neglected crisis at the moment. But interestingly, it was for a shorter period of time, and was smaller than the additional money for Ukraine. So it's back to Parliament, etc. We need to get the Parliament to really be interested in the lives in these places, where we can do much more actually per krona than we can in Ukraine now, where there is already pretty good funding. Thank you.
I'd like to end with one last question to everyone on the panel. If you could give a brief response, and I'll pick up where you left off, Jan. I mean, I think watching the response to the war in Ukraine, you know, the extremely quick humanitarian mobilization, the funding, the attention, was inspiring. And you know, if we only could get a fraction of that for the neglected crisis on this list, it would be a game changer. So I wanted to hear what gives you hope that we can address neglected crises.
Well, it gives me hope that we are able actually increasingly to get the story out on neglected crisis. We're going in specific media, we're going in regional media, we're going globally, because we're better in telling stories, because we have more people there helping the people to tell their own story.
I think I agree on that. I think that's the most important that we do now, is to raise awareness and reach out, and especially to youth. I think that is it's a really important. It's really important to do, and it's a great asset.
I think one, maybe hope is a strong word, but maybe one more optimistic trend is a lot of the momentum around climate, and a lot of more the new finance that's kind of expected, and hopefully that can get to grapple with some of the development challenges that contribute towards just neglected crises.
Well, thank you. No, and hope, as you said, is maybe a strong word, and to speak about success rates or hope when reading a report like this is a bit difficult. But I think, of course, sometimes presenting bills as a government, or and when you get a lot of critical remarks or debates in Parliament, can of course be a bit exhausting when you have to rewrite. But I think the good thing about it is that I think we saw it last year, we've seen it this year, the attention, the involvement from civil society, from UN partners, from humanitarians, from the Parliament. Big discussions on principled issues, and you know, a big. I think it gives at least hope that these are issues that is on people's minds. Maybe they have to be reminded sometimes, but I guess to see that the engagement also among young people in Norway, at least make sure that I think this will remain high on the political agenda in Norway, and any government will be pushed, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, that gives me hope as well, and I hope that we together can keep focus on Burkina Faso, DR Congo, Colombia, Sudan, Venezuela, Burundi, Mali, Cameroon, El Salvador, Ethiopia, and the people in these countries, which are only the tip of the iceberg, the 10 most neglected countries. There's many others that also need our attention and care. So thank you so much to the panelists for being with us, for everyone who's joined here and online. Thank you.